Hello and welcome, everyone. I am so excited to see all of you in the middle of our enduring pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us for episode 29. Man, episode 29 of Alta Asks Live. This is a digital event series we do at altaonline.com. I'm Beth Spotswood, Alta's digital editor. Today, I am so excited, as I know many of you are, to welcome author and Alta contributor Judith Freeman. She's, among other things, a noted biographer of Raymond Chandler. Judith explored Chandler's relationship with his female characters in her article here in our very special noir issue. This is Alta magazine, if you're unfamiliar, and our issue is out right now. You can actually click, there should be a green button right below my face if you'd like to read that article today. Judith is going to be in conversation with Alta Books editor David Ulin. They're going to discuss Chandler, noir, LA writers, hopefully. We were just talking about that a little bit before going live. And the women of noir. So it's going to be a really exciting conversation. If you've got questions for either one of them, please do ask them in the chat section, or there's a question button. I'll be monitoring both of those. And after about a 25-minute conversation, David's going to call me back in and I will get to as many of your questions as we have time for. We're going to go till about 1 p.m. today, so a half an hour. I also, just while I have you, before we get going, wanted to let you know about the California Book Club. It is a new book club we've just launched. We had our first book club event last week. Please visit californiabookclub.com for more on that. David is a huge part of it. It's run by John Freeman. It's got a really exciting panel of guests. And our next author is Reina Grande, who will be talking about The Distance Between Us, her new book. So please do check that out if you're interested. I won't take up any more of your time. Let's get straight to David and Judith, and I'll see you back at the end of this.
Thanks, Beth. And welcome, Judith. It's good to see you.
Hi, David. It's good to see you.
Very excited to have this conversation. And thank you to everyone for coming to our lunchtime conversation. Why don't we start with the piece in the magazine, and then we can kind of move into the biography and Chandler in general, and as much as we can cover in the time that we've got. The piece, your piece in the magazine, which was a real thrill for me to be able to edit and work with you on, is called The Port of Lost Women. And it's a kind of investigation, in a certain sense, of women in Chandler, of Chandler's, I guess, women character in Chandler. Marlowe, Philip Marlowe, the detective, who is known as a kind of lone knight in a way. He has there are always sort of femme fatales or women as foils in the novels. But he remains a kind of loner in most cases. You talk about one character, Anne Reardon, who is the female character that Chandler created, who kind of gives him his what for, I suppose, and kind of imagine what that relationship might have looked like if it had been extended out. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of the essay and its origin and what you were thinking, and also this question of women characters in Chandler, which I think is a fascinating angle through which to think about and imagine his work.
Well, I've always been really interested in Philip Marlowe because I think he's such a layered, multidimensional character. And yet he ends up being attracted to these women who are really, bombshells, black widows, and murdered in 6 out of the 7 Chandler books featuring Marlowe. It's a woman who's the killer. And I began thinking about Marlowe and about his illness, his attitude toward women. And I feel like he's kind of been stuck in this role that's it's kind of a surface bluff in a way, the way that he relates to women. He's always attracted to the woman who ends up being the killer in Blonde Bombshell or the Black Widow. And yet there's one character in all of Chandler's novels who is really Marlowe's equal, his moral equal, his intellectual equal. She has the same strong moral center that Marlowe does. And that's in the book Farewell, My Lovely. And for a long time, I've sort of imagined what would it be like to write a novel from the perspective of one of Chandler's female characters, specifically Anne Riordan in Farewell, My Lovely. It just seemed rich qualities. I then began thinking about the period right after World War II, when some really horribly murders were being committed in Los Angeles, 1947. I came across a line when I was researching my Chandler biography called The Port of Missing Women. And it the number of women who were missing and murdered in Los Angeles during
We're having some
coming through the port of Los Angeles. So these two ideas, the idea that it might be possible to really plumb that complexity of Marlowe, if I could use a female narrator like Anne Riordan, who's really his equal, if they could solve a crime together, and instead of a woman being the murderer in the novel, they would be looking at these really an instance of where a woman is the victim of a really terrible, violent act, like Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, who was killed during that period too. So that was really the essence of beginning to try and reimagine Philip Marlowe and to try and give him a little bit more complexity.
It's a really interesting question because, you know, he, as you say, he is sort of, Marlowe kind of wraps around both ends of that period you're talking about, the Port of Missing Women period, post World War II period in Los Angeles. That Dahlia was killed in 1947. That murder was never solved. It would actually be kind of amazing to have Marlowe solve that case in some way.
I also thought, you know, of James Ellroy's mother, who was murdered during that same period.
Yes.
And I don't think that murderer was ever caught either, just like the Black Dahlia murder was never caught. He taunted the police with notes. But these were really grisly murders, the kind that had never been seen before in Los Angeles. And it isn't that I felt, oh, I would pick the most disturbing, but just the idea that instead of the woman being the murderer in a Marlowe novel, Marlowe is looking for that person who's committed this grisly crime.
Yeah. Now so I want to ask you about the kind of progression of Marlowe. You know, so the books, the sort of prototypes are the stories from the early 30s in Black Mask. The first book is The Big Sleep, which is 1939, very much a novel of the 30s and the kind of depression. And then as Chandler progresses, he as he keeps writing, you know, he at a certain point in the early 50s with The Long Goodbye, he sort of stops writing these kind of self-contained mysteries and starts thinking in a more expansive sense about Marlowe and about his history, right? He brings in, you know, there's Linda Loring, who he falls in love with, and then there's and then there's The Unfinished Poodle Springs, which involves Marlowe as Marlowe after he is married. So, you know, I think there's a really interesting movement on Chandler's part as a writer between that kind of the self-contained mystery that he starts with, and then thinking more expansively about Marlowe as a character. As someone who's spent a lot of time with his work, obviously read all the books, written a book about him. In fact, I want to talk about your book, The Long Embrace, because it is very much a story of Chandler's relationship with women, or with his wife and mother, but with his wife in particular. Can you talk a little? What do you make about that shift that Chandler makes in terms of thinking about this character more broadly as he continues to write about him?
You know, I think that Chandler at one point said that he didn't mind that Marlowe was a sentimentalist because he was too. And he always had been. And I think that aspect of Marlowe, that he's really a very, very sentimental guy. We think of him as being really hard-boiled, but actually there's a lot about Marlowe that's very soft and very feminine, as there was with Chandler. I mean, just the way he wrote about women's clothing and interiors. as Margaret Atwood said, he could have been the editor of a California version of House and Garden magazine. You know, these exquisite set pieces. And Atwood even wrote a little parody, I think it called Being in Love with Raymond Chandler, about how they would have an affair and go to a motel one afternoon, but all they would really do is discuss the furniture and, you know, the old sofa. He makes that shift you're talking about as his wife grows sicker and sicker. Sissy was 17 years older than he was. And in 1954, when they left LA to move to La Jolla, or actually it was 1946, she died in 54, he becomes a little bit more of a sentimentalist until by the time we get to The Long Goodbye, it's a bleeding Marlowe. It was published the year that his wife died. And he, at that point, is just so distraught at the idea that he's losing his wife of 30 years. And as complicated as the marriage was, it was it provided him with real grounding and solace. So I think when he moves into The Little Sister, which is kind of his Hollywood novel, he's becoming much more concerned with Marlowe's well-being, because Marlowe really is becoming lonelier and lonelier and more estranged, less able, I think, to find a balance. And then we get to The Long Goodbye, where he's really, it's Marlowe more human than I think he's been in any of the other novels.
It's hard to be an aging detective, right? I mean, just purely for the risk alone. I mean, the physical risk alone. He's losing a step physically, as well as kind of becoming much more, ending up in much more complicated emotional territory. And so, it's harder for him on every level. I mean, that one of the hallmarks for me of The Long Goodbye, and one of the reasons I think I go back and forth about my favorite Chandler book, but that book is always in the mix, is because it's such a complex Marlowe in a way, a much more complex and vulnerable Marlowe in a sense. I think we're having some technical difficulties. I
can see you.
Okay, I can't see
you and Judith.
I can't see Judith or hear her.
Judith, are you there? Hang tight. Stand by. David, keep talking. I'm going to try and fix this.
Okay, I will vamp. So anyway, I mean, one of the interesting things for me as a reader is that question, and I want to hear what Judith has to say about it, is that question of the more vulnerable, three-dimensional, let's say even human Marlowe. If you think about how Marlowe operates in the early books, he really is fulfilling a kind of archetypal role. Chandler fleshes that role out with some really interesting personal details. His love of chess, as an example. Oh, you're back. Great. I was just answering my question while you were. So so basically, what I want to get at this notion of that kind of more vulnerable Marlowe, the creation of that more vulnerable novel, and Marlowe, and the difficulty, as we were talking about before the technical stuff happened, of being an aging detective, both in terms of the physical demands of the job, but also maybe in terms of the emotional demands of the job, because he's seeing the world in more shaded terms than he might have been when he was in the early novels.
And maybe this is why at the end of that novel, The Long Goodbye, is he comes together with Linda Loring, who's the sister of the woman who's been murdered brutally by Eileen Wade, who of course is the brassy, shiny blonde that Marlowe is really attracted to in the book. But in the end, it's Linda Loring who he allows himself to actually go to bed with. And this is the first time in 6 Marlowe novels that Marlowe has really had that kind of relationship, where he's actually had sex. Marlowe has no history. We see him involved in these sexy scenes where women are kissing him, or he's poking Dolores Gonzalez's breast to see if it's real in The Little Sister. He's kissing women who have tongues that are like darting snakes He's, he's as erotic as a stallion when, he's with Eileen Wade. But I always feel this is a crazy bit of acting on Marlowe's part, and that it's really just surface bluff. And that really, it's kind of like Patricia Highsmith said. She at one point said maleness sits uneasily on Chandler. And sometimes maleness sits very uneasily on Marlowe too. He doesn't quite know what to do with women. So he basically makes himself unavailable to women. And yet, I'll go back to Anne Worden and the article, that I wrote for Alta, which was exciting because I wanted to think about what would it be like putting Marlowe with a woman who was really his moral and intellectual equal, a budding journalist whose father had been a cop, who gives as good as she gets in terms of repartee, and is a very good little detective. What would happen if Marlowe actually was paired, even just for a short time, were to have an affair with a woman like that, as opposed to these types, that we know he may be attracted to, but it's all surface bluff.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit of the book clerk in The Big Sleep, who also just had that great scene when he goes into the bookstore, gives him a kind of run for his money a little bit. And then she doesn't reappear. It appears that there's some kind of actual connection between the two of them, but then, then she's gone. I want to ask you a little bit, since we've been talking about Marlowe and his women, I do want to ask you a little bit about Chandler and, and his relationship with women, which you explicated really beautifully in The Long Embrace. First with his relationship with his mother, and then his relationship with Sissy, his wife, who, as you say, he was significantly older than he was, 17 years older than he was. But he lived with his mother until she died, right? And was sort of kept off getting married to Sissy until his mother was dead. And so I'm curious if we can talk about sort of Chandler's relationship with women and how that may color or influence the way he wrote about Marlowe's.
I think Chandler adored women. I think that was clear. And I also think he put them on pedestals. And that women to him, were to be rescued. And that's where the idea of Marlowe and the White Knight comes from. He felt his mother needed rescuing from the abuse she took from his alcoholic father, who abandoned him when he was 7. And then her relatives humiliated her when they returned to Ireland penniless to live with them. Chandler was a day student at a very good public school, Dulwich College, but he always went home to his mother at night. And his mother was a very controlling woman, and Chandler was really kind of her lifeline. And she did not approve of Sissy. When Chandler moved to LA in 1912, his mother followed. Chandler met Sissy. She was married for the second time. She was a little bit of a libertine. She was quite, I think, a fun woman to be around, as opposed to his mother. But his mother knew something that Chandler didn't, which was she was much older than she said she was. When she married Chandler, she was 53, or he was 43, and he was 34, and she was 52, or something like that. So 2 weeks after his mother died, he married Sissy. And I think that gave him the freedom, to have this relationship that ended up being so important. But the two of them really were such a self-enclosed couple. And then, of course, when Chandler did drink, it caused great problems, and they separated at one point. She took him back. He began writing. After Sissy died, it became clear.
Shoot. Judith, we lost you again.
We'll wait for, let's see.
Give it a sec.
Yeah, let's give it a sec, I think.
Okay. Sorry, y'all. We're having wonky Wi-Fi issues with
Yeah.
Judith. Stand by.
Okay. I can talk a little bit more. I mean, one of the it seems to me that, and I'm curious what Judith thinks about this. I was hoping we were going to get to that. It seems to me that in some way that security that, oh, you're back. Great. I was just about to answer your question, so I'll answer it instead.
Sorry about that. I don't know what keeps
that's fine. Go ahead. Anyway, so yeah, you were saying that they were kind of a unit unto themselves in some way, and that gave him a kind of freedom, but that there was also, you know, when he drank, it's interesting what you were saying about his protecting his mother against the alcoholism of his father, because Chandler himself, you know, as we know, basically drank himself out of the oil business. And then struggled with alcohol for pretty much the rest of his adult life.
Yeah. After Sissy died, he spent a lot of time in London, including with various women who became very close friends. Natasha Spender, Stephen Spender's wife, became one of his closest friends. And he pursued women assiduously. You know, he was very interested in being with women. But again, I think he just liked the company of beautiful women. And one of the people who was kindest to him was Helga Green, his agent at the time. And they were going to get married. She had agreed to marry him, I think, as a way of just saving him from this desperate state of alcoholism that he descended to in the 1958-59. But Chandler, being ever the gentleman, insisted on meeting her father and had a lunch in New York with him. And when Helga's father met him, he just felt like here was a wreck of a man. And Chandler must have sensed that. And he was so distraught that he went back to La Jolla, and within a couple of weeks was dead, had died of a heart attack. So women, they were such a great attraction for Chandler. He loved beautiful women. He loved beautiful hands. Voices were very important to him. All these qualities that women had for him. But he was also, like Marlowe, somewhat, I think, unavailable to women.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about this before we end. You mention in the piece for Alta, Port of Missing Women, the idea, and you were talking a little bit or alluding to it a little bit earlier in the conversation, the idea of thinking about a narrative, a novel, or a detective story with Marlowe and Anne, what that might look like as a book. There have been a number of sort of post-Chandler Marlowes that have come out. First was Poodle Springs, where Robert B. Parker finished Chandler's unfinished novel. I hesitate to call it an unfinished novel because there was only basically one chapter that had been written. There was John Banville's or Benjamin Black's The Black-Eyed Blonde, which sort of sits kind of in between The Long Goodbye and Playback, I guess. It sort of feels like it's written as a kind of quasi-sequel to The Long Goodbye. And then there's Lawrence Osborne's novel, which the name of which escapes me at the moment, which is about an older Chandler, an older Marlowe in his 70s.
Right.
In Mexico, getting drawn into a case. All of those books play with some of those tropes about Marlowe and women that you're talking about. The story that you're thinking, or the story that you were sort of positing, is one which would kind of flip that Marlowe relationship with women a little bit on its head. Have you thought about the possibility of doing such a project?
I have, and I think that there's so much material there. We're looking at Marlowe. We have Marlowe's voice. We have it in 7 novels. And I think drawing on Marlowe's existing voice, but telling the story in a first-person voice of a female narrator would really allow looking at Marlowe in, I think, a rather sweet and sensitive way. I don't think Marlowe needs taking apart or picking apart. But I think whatever you think about those three novels that have been written using Marlowe as a character after Chandler's death, the real challenge is, how do you replicate Marlowe's voice when voice is everything? And it's a really big job. And I think Robert Parker, Poodle Springs, here's Marlowe married to Linda Loring, a really kind of vapid character whose greatest attraction is her $8 million. And yet Parker gives it a good shot. He kind of, he does his best, and it was a very readable book, but he at least knows LA. One of the big problems with the Benjamin Black book, The Black-Eyed Blonde, is I just didn't ever feel that he knew LA. And if you're going to write a novel, Marlowe novel, and set it in LA, you really need to know the city. And he also just made Marlowe a kind of a horny guy, which Marlowe never was. Attracted to the kind of women Marlowe would never be attracted to, and saying things I just didn't really find credible. When I got to Lawrence Osborne's Only to Sleep, it's set largely in Mexico, so that solves the problem of LA. And even though it didn't exactly seem like Marlowe to me, Marlowe's 72 years old in that book, so obviously he's a changed figure. Osborne is such a good writer. He's just really a good writer, and it's kind of a wonderful book. Even though we go back to the same tropes, that it's a woman, a ruthless woman who's the killer through Mexico, trying to track her down. But Osborne really knows Mexico. He really knows the border. He knows San Diego. He's worked as a journalist in that area. So it's got this wonderful atmosphere. But really, it was almost like a combination of Under the Volcano with a visit, to the fair and the whirly gigs and the wildness of Day of the Dead. And that in a combination of a Marlowe novel. I enjoyed it. I thought it was really...
It's my favorite of those three. I agree with you. I agree with you. It's not really... I mean, it is a Marlowe novel in the sense that Marlowe is the main character. It's actually a Lawrence Osborne novel with a character named Marlowe at the center of it. But I agree. I mean, Osborne's a spectacular writer. And my least favorite of those books is the Benjamin Black. For all the reasons that you articulated. It has no sense of Los Angeles at all. And I don't actually think it has a particularly good understanding of Chandler or Marlowe or how those books operate. I found that book profoundly disappointing.
Yeah, it's a mystery novel. But is it a Marlowe novel? It didn't feel that way to me at all. Yeah.
I think we should, Beth, do you want to open it up to some, we have some questions in the Ask a Question queue. Should we open it up to the audience?
Sorry for the technical difficulties, all. We're joining from around the entire West Coast of America, the three of us today. So you're getting a real Idaho, LA, Bay Area. All right, so we've got our first question is from Alta publisher Will Hurst. Judith, he'd like to know, did you actually go to Chandler's favorite bars and order his drink? What were his favorite bars? And can you please confirm his favorite drink?
His favorite drink is, I'm quite sure, a gimlet. And he gives really strong instructions on how to make it. It's half gin and half Rose's lime juice and nothing else. That's it. I did go to some of the bars. I couldn't find so many bars in LA, except that I knew that he went to the HMS Bounty on Wilshire Boulevard across from
the greatest bar in Los Angeles. I'm a great devotee of that bar.
And it hasn't changed. It's still an old red leather booth bar, 1921 or something like that. There's also Tex Restaurant on Sunset. I'm sure Chandler went to Tex. But when he moved to La Jolla, he used to go to the Valencia Hotel, which has the Whaling Bar, which I think has now been remodeled, but it was just a fantastic bar. And when I was doing research, I loved going to the Whaling Bar, sitting in a red leather booth, having a gimlet And another memorable gimmick I had was at Union Station, where the opening scenes of Playback take place. Who knows if Chandler drank there, but it was nice to have a drink there and think of that novel. Thanks, Will.
Judith, I've got some questions about recommendations from you. Are there any modern authors that remind you of Raymond Chandler?
Yes, I have to confess I don't read a huge number of mysteries, but Walter Mosley from the very beginning has seemed to me like Chandler's natural heir. Mm. He knows LA so well, and he uses the city the way that Chandler did by using it to expose all different levels of class in the city. And Chandler certainly wrote about the highbrow, the lowbrow. Walter Mosley's character, Easy Rollins, is, he's, to me, an extraordinary fictional detective. And I would recommend starting with Walter Mosley's first book, Devil in a Blue Dress, published in 1989, when my first novel was published, and when I first met Walter. And we were and we had the same editor, Jerry Howard of Norton. And I stayed up all night in my motel room in Vegas reading Devil in a Blue Dress. I thought it was just so great. So that's my recommendation.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't let everyone know that Walter Mosley will be joining us on December 17th for the California Book Club. I've just added a link to that.
And the book is Devil in a Blue Dress. So
indeed it is. So start reading now, folks, because we'll have that.
Oh, it is. That's great.
Yeah. Judith, can you recommend any authors with a sense of the absurd or a great sense of humor?
Well, I think Margaret Atwood in that essay that I just mentioned, In Love with Raymond Chandler, is a wonderfully good piece of writing. I don't think of her as a absurd writer. That's a good question. The absurd. I don't know. What do you think, David? I'm gonna call on you. You're the book editor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many. I think, one book that I think really gets at the absurdity of LA is a novel by a writer named John Haskell, who lives in New York, but grew up in San Diego and has spent a lot of time in Southern California. I think it's called Out of My Skin. And it's about a writer, like a sort of quasi-journalist, a freelancer who ends up in Los Angeles on a visit. And he just sort of wanders around. He meets people. He knows some people. He looks like Steve Martin, and he becomes a Steve Martin impersonator. And then he starts to lose himself in the impersonation. It's a really strange and remarkable. I've read it a few times over the years. It came out about 10 or 15 years ago. It's a really strange and lovely novel, but it gets at kind of both a little bit of the rootlessness of some part of Los Angeles, but also the kind of myth of Hollywood and how it draws people, and then kind of what happens to people who end up not being Steve Martin, but being the guy who impersonates Steve Martin. Like you can hire him for a party, or he's on the boulevard. And I think it really captures that side of Los Angeles in a way that I haven't seen another writer do. It's strange and sort of elusive and lovely novel. And 200 pages. I'm also a big fan of novels that come in at 200 pages if they can pull it off.
Okay.
For aspiring writers who wish to submit material to David L. Ulin, 200 pages.
200 page 201. That's where we stop.
With that, we've gone a little bit over, so it's an honor to have you with us today, Judith. And David, thank you so much for running the show. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Please join us at Alta Asks Live next week, where we will have Obi Kaufman. He's the author and artist of the California Field Atlas and his newest book, The Forests of California. He will join us on Wednesday, October 28th at 12:30 p.m. right here at Crowdcast, Alta Journal. Again, Judith and David, thank you so much. Everyone, thanks for joining us. This video will be up online on altaonline.com later today. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Judith. Thanks, Beth. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.